Hello guys, today we will be starting a new series on the Caro-Kann defense, and specifically we will be talking about the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann today. I will discuss all sorts of different lines that can come out of the advanced variation, and I will also be giving recommendations to beginners and intermediate players as to which variations they should study and which ones they should focus on, and which ones would be the most beneficial at their level. However, I still recommend watching the whole video at first, and after you watch the whole video, then once you come back, you can rewatch the part that covers your specific variation. So without wasting any more time, let's get into it. So white plays e4, we play c6. The idea of c6 is that we want to play d5, but we want to have the ability to recapture with the c pawn. As we know, in the Scandinavian defense, we play d5, and then white takes, we take, and this is not what we want to do, because now the queen is out, the queen can be attacked, but if we play c6 and then d5, we can always recapture with a pawn, just like this. This is the exchange variation. This is not what we will be talking about today. However, we will discuss this in the future. Okay, so today we will be talking about the advanced variation, which is e5 in this position on move 3. And this is a very important move because it takes away two key squares from black, that is f6 and d6. These are the two development squares that white is taking away from black. Now the knight cannot go to f6 and the bishop cannot go to d6 after pawn to e6. d6 square is covered, so the bishop can never go there. Okay, so how do we play against this? There are two main lines in this position. There's bishop to f5, which is the main line, and there's also c5, which is a side line. This one is what I would recommend if you are a beginner player. This c5 side line. This is called the Botvinnik-Karls variation. We will discuss this later on in this video. For now, let's focus on bishop to f5, which is the standard main line, getting the bishop out. This is the difference between Caro-Kann and French defense. As you know, in the French defense, let's go back, e6, d4, d5, e5, this bishop stays behind the pawn chain. In Caro-Kann, that's not what we want to do. We want to make sure this bishop gets out to f5. Okay, so from here, there are many ways white can continue this position. Let's discuss the most popular way, which is called the short variation, which is knight f3, e6, and bishop e2. It can also be reached with bishop e2 and then knight f3, like something like this. However, it's the same, and it transposes back into this position. So here, there are two main ideas. Well, there's really one main idea, but I think there are two critical ways to handle this position. One is to play c5. We can play c5 right away, and after bishop to e3, we capture, white captures, and we kind of go into this forced line. Knight e7, c4 is one of the main moves, forced for black, because black has to be very careful here. White has some options, like for example here, white can castle, play knight d2, or some other moves. Let's say white chooses c4, knight c6, queen a4, and we go into this forced line that's kind of equalish. Maybe white has more activity and white is a very tiny bit better, but I would not personally recommend this because black has to be ultra precise here, and it is not something I would willingly go for. Instead of that, I will show you a different way to play, which is playing knight d7 in this position. So we start out with knight d7. The idea of knight d7 is that, first of all, we're developing a knight. Secondly, we're supporting c5, but also we're supporting f6, because after f6 is played, This pawn, of course, would be pressuring e5, but this knight would also be pressuring e5. And after a move like castles, we don't play f6 right away, but we play a5. And here, this is already out of theory, by the way, just so we are very clear here. There are no masters games from this position. However, this idea of playing knight d7 and a5 is backed up by the engine, and I think it is a very clever way to play. Here, if white continues to develop normally, let's say white plays a move like knight c3, we can push the pawn to a4, and if white allows us, we can even push the pawn to a3. And of course, that will weaken the dark squares in white's position, and we will be able to use them with bishop b4. And now we play f6, bishop a5. I will let you guys analyze this position on your own, but I just want you to understand the general idea of this variation that I'm showing you. This is not very well known, by the way, so if you actually play this, a lot of players will not know what to do against this. So the idea of knight d7 and a5 is to push this pawn up the board, and you play f6 if white plays a4. So if white stops you from advancing your pawn, now you play f6. And the difference is we have this b4 square. Now, you might ask, how do we have the b4 square? The pawn is on c2, it can go to c3 and take away this square. However, white does not want to play pawn to c3. White wants to play knight d2 and pawn to c4. And the reason why white wants to do that is because white wants to open up the center, because black's king is still in the center. And what that will do is that will grant us the b4 square permanently. If white plays c3, that's not very challenging. You continue by pressuring this pawn. You capture, like for example, after knight d2, you can play knight h6 and knight to f7, and basically you are pressuring this pawn quite a bit. So like knight b3, knight f7, captures, queen captures, and you have a very, very active position. I'm not gonna get into any more details here because I feel like this is already too in-depth, because there are many ways a white can set up here, and memorizing these lines is not going to help you. You should try to understand them as much as possible. Remember, never memorize any lines. Try to understand why each move is good and why it works. Okay, now let's move on to a different line. Let me just open up this. Let me just go back. So after e5, bishop f5, here there is another move. There are multiple moves, as I said earlier. So now we're going to be looking at h4. This is the second most played move, and it is called the tall variation of the Caro-Kann. And we have two ways to play against this. We have h5 and we have h6. Of course, we cannot play e6 right away because that will get our bishop trapped on this diagonal. We lose the bishop and we are down a piece. We're losing the game. But what we can do is we can stop this g4 move by playing h5 ourselves. And I think this is a very strong move. And here white plays bishop to d3. We capture the bishop. We play e6. Okay, white plays bishop g5, you know, normal developing move. Queen to b6, attacking the pawn. However, in many lines we don't want to take it. Like for example, if white plays knight d2 here, which I think is the best move, we don't want to take this pawn because, let me just show you, because if we take this pawn, rook b1, rook b7, we are temporarily up a pawn here, but it is very, very dangerous. White is super active. I would not advise you to go into this line. This is already much worse. The computer is telling me this is plus 1.5. You don't want to go for this variation. However, what you can do is you can play this move queen a6. Let me briefly go back here and play a different move other than knight d2, and you will understand why I'm doing this in a moment. So let's say white plays knight f3 in this position instead. We can play queen a6 here regardless, but here it's actually even stronger because there's no c4. If the queen trade happens, then this is better for black because, well, not better, but black equalizes already, actually maybe even slightly better for the black pieces, but at least black has successfully equalized. There's no more danger here for black. If white moves here instead, let's say queen b3, then we have the diagonal and our opponent cannot castle, so that's plus for us. And that's why a knight d2 here is the best move, because that stops queen a6 because you can play c4. And after bishop to b4, there's b3. However, your opponents need to know this position this much in order to keep a tiny bit of advantage, and most likely they're not going to know this. So I would advise going for this queen b6 and the queen a6 idea, which will go into this queen trade line, which is very, very beneficial for black. You know, you can do a lot of things. You can go knight b4 to go after this fork. You can play c5 and you just continue developing very normally. This position is very decent for black. Okay, let's go back here. So as I said, instead of h5 in this position, there's also h6. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this move, but it is playable. After g4, you have three options. You have bishop e4, bishop h7, and bishop d7. Now, bishop d7 is actually the most popular move for the Masters database. So Masters play bishop d7 here quite a lot, followed by e6 and c5 ideas. But this is not really in the theme of the position because we are really going back to d7 and then putting the bishop behind the pawn chain again. You know, this doesn't make any sense. So I want you guys to stick to the themes of the position. However, if you are a higher rated player, this is also a very strong weapon. Okay, now let's discuss the difference between bishop e4 and bishop h7. If we go bishop e4, this is more beneficial because we are forcing out f3. The reason why we are forcing out f3 is because if something else is played, let's say the rook moves to h3 or something, then we play e6, we finish our development. But what white wants to do here is white wants to win time. So white wins a tempo by playing the move f3. We know we have to go back, bishop h7, and now white plays this move e6. And whenever you see e6 in Caro-Kann, usually you should avoid taking. There are some lines where you can take, but you should play queen d6 here instead. And after takes, now we reap the benefits of forcing out this f3 move, because this f3, this pawn on f3 is occupying a square for the knight. So the knight cannot go to f3. If the knight could go to f3, then he can horse around, go to e5, maybe potential sacrifices on g5, and that is very dangerous. So this f3 inclusion, this bishop e4 f3 inclusion, takes away a square from the knight. So that's why we play bishop e4 first, and back in this position, that's why we play bishop e4 first, force out f3, then we go back. And after e6, we can go queen d6. If white does something else, let's say not a great move, but let's say knight c3, you just go e6, you finish development, you're doing very well. Okay, so that is the tall variation of the Caro-Kann. Now let's move on to the next one. Let me just go back, just like that. Okay, so advanced variation, bishop f5 again. And now the variation that I'm going to show you does not have a name. However, it is the third most played move in this position in the Masters database, and that move is knight to d2. And knight d2 is very venomous, because the idea of knight d2 is that after e6, the knight goes to b3 and it controls c5. So the main pawn break that we want to go for is now inhibited, I guess you can say. So what we want to do here is we want to play this move a6. a6 is a very strong move because it prepares c5. So we're controlling this b5 square, and we are preparing to push the pawn to c5, and the bishop cannot go there, and basically we are breaking out, we're challenging white's very strong center. Even if white plays a move like knight to f3, for example, in this position we can still play c5, because after this exchange we have queen a5 check, which picks up the knight. So let's say bishop d2, queen a5, or c3 is probably a better move. We take the pawn, we take the knight on c5, and we have equalized here. The position is, it's equal. Maybe you can argue that white has two bishops, so white might be slightly better in the long run, but you are fine here with black. You can target this pawn with a move like knight c6, and then play knight e7, knight g6, and a lot of lines, so you can pressure this pawn on e5. This position is playable. So going back, I will briefly show you this line. However, I don't think a lot of players in this position would play a move like bishop to e3, which is the move recommended by the engine, because it stops c5. It's way more natural for white to play knight f3. However, we're in an uncharted territory here. I will still show you this line because it's the engine recommended line, and I want to show you the most precise line. Here we play knight d7, knight f3, knight e7, and here what we do is that we bring the bishop back to g6, so we free up the square for the knight on f5. So this knight, remember, wants to go to f5 in a lot of lines, and because obviously it cannot go to f6, so it goes knight e7, knight f5. And after knight h4, knight to f5, knight takes, bishop takes, white castles. This is a very equal position. Black is doing fine here. I would even argue that black has a slightly more favorable position, just because this pawn advancement does not make a lot more sense after the pieces are traded off, because in chess, whenever you have more space, meaning you are controlling more squares in your opponent's position, you want to keep the pieces on the board, because if the pieces get traded off, this space advantage becomes negligible, and it actually becomes overextended in a lot of endgames. So that's the difference between having more space and having an overextended position. It comes down to how many pieces are on the board, how many pieces are still remaining on the board, and whether you are actually restricting your opponent or not. Okay, let's move on to the next variation now. Let's go to the oops, I keep skipping forward, sorry about that. So next one we will be talking about is the bayonet attack. So after bishop f5, the bayonet attack is g4 right away. Now from here on out, we are getting into really uncharted, no, I don't want to say uncharted territory, because this is still theory, but we're getting into moves that are played less and less. But I still want to show these lines so you know what to do, but you don't really need to focus on these lines as much as the main lines, such as the short variation and the tall variation. But okay, let's see what happens here. Anyways, after g4, we play this same idea that I mentioned earlier. We don't go to g6 right away. We first bait out f3, and then we drop back to g6. And if you are paying attention, you're going to realize that this position looks a lot like the tall variation where we play h6, bishop e4 and then bishop to h7, this one. However, here the bishop still remains on g6 and the pawn has not been pushed to h4. Well, actually, white does that here. White pushes the pawn to h4. However, we don't need to play h6 now. We can play h5, so we can directly challenge this g4 pawn. And the key difference here in these positions is that after e6 and then queen d6, e takes f7, we can actually take with the bishop. We don't have to take with the queen, with the king. Even if the king was the only option to take with on f7, it's still okay. These positions, believe it or not, are totally fine for the black pieces. Even if the king takes, you can play knight d7 and e5 and your position, believe it or not, is great. The king is quite safe on f7, which is crazy, but I guess it's due to the development or the lack of development by white and the fact that we have so many pieces out already with the black pieces, so it's much better for black in that sense. And I think that this position, for example, is already better for black. It's a better version of the advanced variation in the Tal, basically in the Tal variation with the h6. It's a better version of this because here, after takes, king takes, we go into this line, and even though white is doing okay here, it looks a bit scary because after f4 we cannot easily execute e5. But we can develop very safely here. We need to take the pawn on g4. This is a very forced line. If you play this h6 move, you have to know this line with bishop h7 and then queen d6 and king takes and a knight f6 and knight takes g4. You need to know this line. However, it's very complicated, and that's why I don't recommend playing this here. That's why I recommend playing h5 against the Tal variation. Okay, so now that we have established how these positions are similar and why this position is a better version of the other position in the Tal variation, now we can move on to the next one, which is the Wonder Wheel attack. I actually had a game in this variation today. I ended up winning, even though I made a mistake in the middle game. But I ended up coming back. So the Wonder Wheel attack is knight to c3, and after e6, now white plays g4. Okay, so we go back to g6. Here there is no, well, we can't even go to e4, right? I was going to say there is no need to bait out f3, but we shouldn't go here regardless because the white knight can always take us, and that's going to be bad for us. So we have to go to g6 here. We don't go to e4 because the knight's on c3. White plays knight to e7, and here we strike in the center with c5, typical Caro-Kann idea. White plays h4, h5, knight to f4, and here we play this move bishop to h7. And bishop to h7 is a very, very strong move. I know we're sacrificing a pawn. I did not blunder that. This is the idea. We sacrifice the h5 pawn and we go after white's center. For example, in this position, if white plays bishop to b5, which looks like a very natural move, however, it is an inaccuracy. I don't want to call it a mistake. It is an inaccuracy. We can go knight e7, and this very cool move, bishop to h6. We cannot take the bishop because we get checkmated here. We don't want to get checkmated, so we don't take the bishop. But we play queen c7, and this center is just falling apart. It looks very scary, but it's not very scary at all. Let me check the evaluation here. Yeah, this is minus 0.6, 0.5, 0.6 after knight takes g7. Other moves are -1 or even better for black. So I think this variation is not really that testing. However, bishop b5 is not the greatest move. The best move here is to actually take on c5, and after we take back, bishop b5 now, we are gambiting this g7 pawn, as you can see. If white takes this, we can always play king to f8, and white has to go back, and this gives us time. weirdly enough, in the Caro-Kann, if you ever get into this situation where the king is on the f file, it's actually quite safe. The king is under no danger currently. You know, if you give white like 3 moves like f4, bishop d3, and then like f5, then it gets super scary. But of course, you know, white doesn't get to move 3 times in a row. That would be cheating, and that would be very unfair. But here we're totally fine. After bishop to b5 in this position, queen c7, black has a totally playable position, and it is very much okay. Okay, so now let's move on to the next variation. So the next variation is going to be the Bronstein variation, which starts after knight e2. We play e6, a very normal move, knight to g3, and we go back, bishop to g6, h4, h5, and here we do something very similar to what we did in the vendor wheel attack. After bishop e2, we sacrifice the h5 pawn. So as you can see, this is a common theme in these sorts of positions. Again, we play c5, so we strike in the center, and after knight takes h5, c takes d4, the knight goes back to f4, we move the bishop, let's say bishop to f5, and we play this position, which is better for us. So if you can think logically about this position, you will realize that this was not a loss of a pawn, this was more like a trade, right? We traded the h pawn, which is less valuable, for the central d pawn, which is more valuable. And if white ever takes, you know, then we can continue developing with knight c6 and do all that stuff. Let me quickly check. Yeah, that's the correct line. Or we can even take the pawn on h4. I was thinking about that as well, but it's minus 1.5. This is a very strong position for black. If white plays g4 here, which looks sort of natural because you're following the themes of Caro-Kann and you're following the themes of the position, what you can do is you can go bishop e4 and again bait out f3. But in this case, it's for a different reason. It's because we want to open up this diagonal. So here we take on h4 because we're threatening the rook, and he's threatening the bishop, we're threatening the rook. If white takes, we take back, but this is a check. And since this is a check, you know, our bishop is not lost. The king has to move, and then we just retreat the bishop. We are doing very, very well. Okay. Lastly, the last line that I want to talk about in the advanced variation of the Caro-Kann is this line. So here, I mentioned earlier that there were 2 moves in the position, but I only talked about bishop f5 lines. However, a second most played move in this position is this pawn to c5. And this is what I would recommend to a lot of beginners because, first of all, a lot of players will be prepared for bishop f5 and they will not be prepared for c5. And secondly, to punish this c5 move, you have to play some very unnatural moves. Like, for example, when a beginner looks at this position, okay, beginner thinks I can, you know, just defend my center and then continue playing like this because I don't want to take on c5 because I want to maintain the integrity of my center. However, that's actually the best thing to do. A lot of players here will play c3, in which case you can play knight c6, knight f3, takes, and you don't go to f5 anymore. You go to g4 now. So whenever you can, make sure to pin the knight on f3. Okay? In the main line, you go to f5 because you cannot go to g4 here. Let me go back. You cannot go to g4 here. Queen will just take you. You lose a piece. However, in some positions, you will be able to play. You will be able to. Well, let me just go back. c3, knight c6, knight to f3, takes, bishop g4. You will be able to pin this knight on f3 to the queen, and in a lot of positions you even take this knight because that weakens the d4 pawn because you're removing the defender of the d4 pawn. So this is one of those situations where bishop for a knight exchange is actually quite useful for the black pieces. A lot of times it's not, because bishops are generally better than knights. However, there are exceptions to almost every rule in chess. So we have to make sure to understand when it is okay to trade the bishops and when it is not okay to trade the bishops for knights. Okay, so that's how most of your opponents will handle this position. They will play this way, but the main way to play is actually d takes c5. And I will still show you how to play against this. You play e6, you block the bishop in, but you are going to win one of your pawns back. And after a move like a3, your opponents are not going to play a3. This is just the most played move in the Masters database. Let's look at it briefly. After bishop to c5, knight f3, we go a6, and we have a very standard development. So this is the line. I'm not going to explain all the details here, because this is not something that is going to happen in your games most likely. So I'm basing this video off of practicality. A lot of your opponents in this position are going to play moves like knight to f3 or bishop to e3, and then make sure to play make sure to be very careful here, because if you play a move like knight c6, you might run into f4, and it's going to be very difficult to win this pawn back. However, in this position you can play knight to d7, and after, like, let's say bishop to b5, you go knight e7, knight f3, knight c6, or knight f5, and you go into this position, which is quite okay for the black pieces. But the difference is that the black bishop, the black light square bishop, still remains behind the pawn chain. So that's why this line is not as popular as the bishop f5 line. However, if you are a beginner player, you should still go for this, because you will get a lot of games where your opponent plays c3 or plays knight f3, and you will be able to punish them very easily by developing and playing very natural moves. So that's gonna be the video today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope to continue this series, and let me know how you like it. Let me know what I could improve in these series videos. And I'm going to see you next time. Have a great day.